evening. We are very happy of having all of you here. I want to show, before the official opening by our Dean Michel, I want to show you one video that Ari Salazar, that is a young lady, 17, that is there. She said, well, let's have something and some idea from children, from young people, thinking about what you are doing, what the rights, the equity. And we said, well, it's a great thing, but it's not very easy to do that. No? Well, for me. And she said, no, I can do it. So let me show this, what I don't even know how to show it. So I want to start with that, because really it was
no children will go unloved. They'll have love from their parents or from their family, and they will be taken good care of, because I think care is the most important thing in the world.
I don't believe that an education's worth should be defined on a person's socioeconomic background, because depending on how much money children have or their families, that affects what education they receive, and that essentially deprives them of opportunities which they could have in their futures. So in my ideal world, I think every child should have an opportunity to at least have a secondary education. If they don't have access to that education, the children are exploited and they have to work hours that a normal child should not have to work.
I think in our society we take it for granted having all these things that are as simple as social security numbers and accessible health care and being able to work. In my ideal world, the government would recognize this large group of people that everyone seems to forget about and help them get social security numbers, help them get health care, so that they can help themselves and support themselves, so the cycle doesn't keep happening all over the world.
Child abuse is something that is one of the worst things that could happen in this world. I mean, it's a very shameful topic. You're kind of just destroying all these futures for these children that could potentially grow up to do something so much better. In my ideal world, every child should be given the love and the support and the care that they need to thrive in the future, so that we can only go onward from here and make the world a better place.
I think a balance has to be struck between giving children a voice and maybe not, because on one hand they are going to inherit the earth once the older people are gone, but they may not be as experienced as adults. But I definitely think there is a bias that adults might not take children or kids or even people our age as seriously. And I think that should change, because again, we are going to inherit the world, so we should have a say in how it's shaped. In an ideal world, of course, everyone should get their say, but that's difficult because obviously very young children might not be aware of all of the issues that are facing them. I think definitely maybe reduce the voting age a little or something like that. I think it's a social problem, so I think we just have to ask adults to change their mentality of how they see kids, because we do see nowadays that kids are making a difference, like Malala, for example. So I think they should just take our ideas and our input into account. So, yeah.
So, my dear Michel, please.
Thank you. We do the hard work. Thank you for giving me the honor of opening up this evening's events. I think it's important for me to start out by letting you know that I'm the mother of a 2-year-old, Alexander DePass Paulson, and he is my Lord and Master. And as we have a conversation tonight about equity for children and the rights of children, I always think about my dear Alexander, and I am very lucky, he's very lucky, that I can support and protect his rights. But there are a lot of children that don't have an adult that can help them do that. So this is what this evening is about. And I have the honor of welcoming you on behalf of not only the New School, but also the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. I'm Michelle DePass, I'm the Dean of the Milano School. My 1-year anniversary is actually this week, so I am no longer a rookie. And so thank you for allowing me to open up this evening's stimulating events and program. I also just have to ad-lib for a second in that I live in New Jersey and I drive to Newark every day and I listen to the BBC every morning. And this morning there was a story on a reporter was there in the heart of Sierra Leone where there was no medical help, but the reporter was there and the story was on the burials that were happening in the community. And he walked across the street and there were 23 children across the street who thought that they were far enough away to protect themselves. And he asked, how many of you have been orphaned recently through Ebola? And every child raised their hands. And he said several of them looked feverish. And it was very frustrating that we were hearing this from a reporter. The reporter can get there, but the facility that can protect the right to proper care cannot. And I'm not talking about a specific facility, I just mean in general, what we need to be able to protect that right. And so I thank you all for the work that you're doing here. At the New School, we do share a lifelong commitment to be able to educate the next generation and leaders in urban policy and international affairs and management, and several of those future leaders are here in the room. We're committed to our students, and I hope that you have an opportunity to engage with some of them this evening. Our partners tonight, Equity for Children, Young Lives of the University of Oxford, UNICEF, UNDP, and CommuniLife are also very dedicated to strengthening the policies and programs for children that are living in poverty. And I've been learning that they do that through several lenses. The first is through evidence gathered through dedicated research over time. The second is an international focus. The third is urban issues faced in the 21st century. And the fourth is diversity. And with us, we have experts in the field. We have Young Lives, the University of Oxford program, whose longitudinal study of childhood poverty adds substantially to our knowledge about children and how they grow from birth to 15. UNICEF and UNDP colleagues, of whom I met several outside before this evening, push us to ask the right questions about what it's like to grow up in unequal societies, how this century can be better to serve children living in poverty, to ensure the fulfillment of their rights. CommuniLife, offering insights about New York City and their children and their families who are underserved, and how to think about housing and community development to assist those with unrealized rights. We are proud to serve as a convener for tonight's conversation, especially on the 21st anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So thank you for allowing us to do that. Just like everyone here in the room tonight, my own work in this area is based upon deep beliefs in equity. That's what I do. That's what I live. And the inequities still persist, even though all of us in the room are committed to it and dedicated to it. Despite progress in the areas such as child survival and nutrition, children worldwide are still disproportionately affected by poverty and inequality, and that's a shame. The nation's communities are changing. Demographic, economic, and political realities are shifting, yet race and class-based inequality continues to rise. The paradigm shift towards greater inequality in the US began in the mid-1970s. But I still believe that public policy can and must serve as a vehicle to reverse the trend towards inequality, and instead help advance economic and social inclusion. Tonight is a great example of what we do here at the New School and what we can all achieve together. We are working with you to provide access to the leading thinkers and advocates who are working to build a more inclusive and just society through public policy. So, now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Alberto Minuhin, who I've learned a lot from since I've been here in this past year. Thank you. I'm pupil to your teacher. Alberto started Equity for Children here at the New School in 2006. 30 years ago, he began advocacy for child rights. 30 years ago. And few people were thinking at that time about equity for children. Now the world is catching up, but we still have our leading thinker here with us, and we're very proud of him. Alberto's multi-decade international expertise in the area of child's rights and social policy through lectures, books, evidence-based research, teaching. I can go on, but it's all made him a pioneer in the field. He and his team are working tirelessly on these issues. So I enjoy tonight's conversation and program, and I give you, again, Alberto. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, for this. I want to thank also Michael Cohen, that is the Director of International Affairs. I want to thank Genei Salazar, that is here. She's the Deputy Director of Equity for Children, but she was working on all this, the full team, and the volunteers that are working here, and especially the Young Life colleague that came from Oxford, and 2 days ago, so they are ready for the presentation today. And let me say a few words. With Young Life, we have a long-term relation and collaboration. I think that 2 or 3 years ago, we presented here, we had a great presentation of the third round of the results, and a very good debate, and we, all the time we are in contact and trying to doing and thinking on doing new things, no? And basically, the concern that we share is they are producing incredible evidence, no? About what is going on with the life of children. They are following 12,000 kids in developing countries. Is, for me, is one of the most important research that are around the world. But the question all the time is how we will change the life of family and children with this, how we promote. So this evidence that we will see today will give space for this conversation. And today event we frame also as part of the 25th anniversary of the Convention of the Right of the Child. It's 25 years, it's a long term, and it's nothing. There is a tango that says 30 years is nothing. No? But a lot of good things happen. We have a lot of things to celebrate with the Convention of the Right of the Child, because many, many good things happen, and we can see changes in many of the countries, and that's the point of celebration. However, we are, at the same time, we are seeing the situation of poverty, inequality, what is going on, what Michelle was saying about the kids in Ebola and that orphan. We were talking with the UNICEF people. They are estimated at 8,000 or 7,000, and the estimation for the next year is, I don't know how many more. So there is a lot of things that going on, and we need to change around the world. That's the first thing that we need to be aware. And the second thing is that probably in some moment we need to review the Convention of the Right of the Child. It's a new century, new things are happening around the world. The corporations are so strong around the world that we need to ask for things for the corporation. There is, I want to say, a very close friend that some of the people here know, Eduardo Bustelo. He was part of UNICEF, and he was a big promoter of the Convention of the Right of the Child, and we worked together on that. In the last 5 years we were discussing, and he was saying, we need to change things, there are new things now going around. So let's be aware of that. And we want to celebrate, but we want more. That's the point, no? So, today's objective. We have two objectives. First, we will see the evidence, and my idea is that it's a learning moment for all of us, especially for me. But we will have a conversation between us. That's the idea that I have in mind. And conversation on what? On policies. What is the best thing that we can do for changing and improving the situation? The second thing that is the objective of today is an advocacy thing. It's not that, I don't think that we are trying to advocate between us, because many of us are very convinced of all this. The point, and that's what I want to convey in all of you, is to take this discussion to the action that you are doing and the thing that you are doing every day, and to take your organization and the messages that are coming from here, and to promote the thing that we will be discussing. So we will have now how we will do today. We will have two brief presentations from our friends from Young Life, and after that a panel that will discuss two questions, basically, to motivate the debate about Among Us. And after that, we will have a conversation. So I want to pass the floor to Young Life. I think that Jeannie will start. So Jeannie Morrow. She's the deputy director of Young Life, with a long experience on children's issues and childhood ethics and method of research. Yeah? I'm not wrong.
You're not wrong.
So, and she has a master in sociology of childhood and children's rights at the Institute of Education and University.
I ran the course.
You ran the course.
Yeah.
Okay. You ran the
I did.
you ran the course.
Yeah,
That's,
exactly.
okay. Okay. So I give the floor to her.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
And after that, let me introduce also Paul Dolman, the Senior Policy Officer of Young Life. And his work is to look at the research and to see how to translate research into policies. Not an easy task. Okay, so the floor is
Okay,
yours.
thank you so much, Alberto, and it's such a privilege to be here and to actually to have such a big audience, and I hope that I will speak clearly and not too quickly. I do have a tendency to speak very fast. So it really, for me, as someone who taught a master's program on the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child for 7 years, it was such a pleasure for me to see that the context for the presentation that I'm giving is the 25th anniversary. And I think I just want to repeat some of the things that have already been said. This is from the UN General Assembly report of the Secretary General on the status of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We're celebrating or commenting on the status of the UNCRC. We've seen huge progress achieved through a holistic approach to child development. Child survival and enrollment rates in school have gone up massively. But as everybody has said in the context for this presentation, widespread inequities are affecting the poorest and most vulnerable children. And this is a global issue. It's not just a question for low-income countries, it's a question for all countries. The report talks about an unfinished agenda, and it also focuses on and emphasises the importance of child protection, which links quite nicely to the film that was made by the young people at the beginning of this. And of course, the context for this is, as has been pointed out recently in a World Bank report, is that 47% of all people living in extreme poverty are aged 18 years or younger. I mean, so this is a huge question that needs to be addressed. I'm just going to, I'm conscious of the time, so remind me if I go on for more than about 10, okay? I just want to tell you a little bit about Young Lives, our research study. It's a multidisciplinary study that aims to improve the understanding of childhood poverty. It aims to provide evidence, as Alberto has generously said, to improve policies and practices in low-income countries. We're following nearly 12,000 children in 4 countries, and the countries are Ethiopia, the state of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana in India. That state was formerly Andhra Pradesh and bifurcated in June this year, Peru and Vietnam, and we're following the children over 15 years. So we've now covered an 11-year period. The first data were collected in 2002, and we're reporting, as Alberto has said, on the 4th round of our survey. We also have included 4 waves of qualitative research with a small sample, nested sample, of 50 of the Young Lives children in each country. And because one of the early findings from Young Lives was worrying indications that schools were not improving children's learning, we added a component that did research in the Young Lives children's schools. So as Alberto has also said, we cover 2 age cohorts of children in each country. 2,000 children born in around 2000 to 2001, they're the main part of the study, and 1,000 children who were born in about 1994 to 95. So they're now about 20. We call them the older cohort, and they were only actually included as a pilot, but we've managed to hold on to them throughout the course of the research. And of course, this older cohort are absolutely fascinating right now because they've been making transitions into adulthood around this time. Young Lives is a pro-poor sample, so we sample from 20 sites in each country, reflecting country diversity, rural, urban, and diverse livelihoods and ethnicities. It's not actually a representative sample. This is quite common in cohort studies. And it's a collaboration between the University of Oxford and partners in each study country who gather the data and who we've managed to work with over the whole period of the study. The study was actually commissioned by the UK Department for International Development, who, and I said this last night at the seminar in CUNY, if anyone can remember the turn of the millennium, there was a huge wave of optimism. And the UK government wanted to track the progress of the Millennium Development Goals. It's hard to remember that wave of optimism now, but it was a visionary thing to do. I mean, to commission a study in 4 countries all at once over this period was pretty ambitious. But we've also received funding from the Dutch Government International Section to do the school study and Irish Aid. And we're undertaking various collaborations, including with the UNICEF Office of Research in Florence. So that's the study, and this is a way to visualize our research. So I don't know if you can see, but at this point I need a pointer really. But here we are in 2014 now. We're just at this very moment completing the qualitative data gathering in Andhra Pradesh, and we'll finish the study with following the children. Well, I say, should we finish the study? I don't think so, because to stop with the younger cohort when they're 15 seems like now a very unfinished story to tell. So it would be a shame to stop. The older cohort will be 22 when we do the final round of the survey in 2016. So lots of potential there. So what have we seen in 10 years of children's lives? So this is that we've seen the economies of all 4 Young Lives countries grow very rapidly in the first decade of the 21st century. And this growth has been accompanied by infrastructural improvements, increased service access associated with the MDGs. So we've seen increased external investment, road and communications infrastructure. We've seen primary school enrollment become near universal across the sample in 3 of our countries, and it's rapidly increasing in Ethiopia. We've seen the rollout of social protection schemes focused on poor families, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India, for example, in Peru, the Conditional Cash Transfer Scheme Juntos, and in Ethiopia, another employment scheme that helps poor families. We've seen health insurance in Vietnam and Peru and in India, and in Ethiopia the rollout of health extension workers. And the table down the side gives you an example of Peru, where we've seen increase in internet access, electricity, flush toilets, sanitation and piped water. So these are good news stories. I'll skip the slide there. And if we look at what's happened to the young people at the age of 19, we can see that actually impressive numbers are continuing in studying, sometimes combining study and work. Large numbers are working only, and we also have gender disparities in who is not working, and I'll come on to explain why that is in the United Andhra Pradesh sample. But basically, as I say, substantial numbers are still studying 19. But what we find is that it's the least poor young people, those whose parents had higher levels of education, and those growing up in urban areas who are staying longer in education. We see gender differences in 3 out of 4 countries by the age of 19 in WHO studies. Young men are much more likely to remain studying in Andhra Pradesh, India, and young women in Ethiopia and Vietnam. And we find that poorer young women and those living in rural areas are more likely to be married and to have given birth. So these are the percentages of the young women in the older cohort, and we see the higher levels in Andhra Pradesh, India, and perhaps surprisingly lower levels in Ethiopia that one might have anticipated. We have to be a bit cautious about that because it could be to do with where our samples are. But when we look at birth rates, we find that there are quite high levels of young women who've given birth in Peru and in Andhra Pradesh, India, unsurprisingly in India because of the high levels of marriage, and lower levels in Vietnam and again in Ethiopia. So one could say that it could be, there's been a huge policy push on early marriage in Ethiopia and other countries, and it's perhaps because of that that we're seeing these lower rates that we might have expected. So I'm now going to hand over to Paul, who's going to talk about the key questions for policy.
Thank you, Ginny, and just also to say thank you very much for attending today, for Equity for Children, for the other organisers. As Ginny says, it's a real privilege to be here tonight, and we've appreciated the long-run relationship that Alberto mentioned, and I'm very glad to be considering it, to be continuing it. So Ginny's given us a bit of a starter in terms of the nature of the Young Lives study, the particular question about a longitudinal study which looks at the same individuals over time and what might be going on in their lives, which offers us some particular advantages in trying to understand how earlier circumstances in life might pay off later in terms of children's development. I wanted to move us on a little bit by talking a little bit about some key questions for policy, and then to wind back a little bit earlier in young people's lives. Ginny has started by looking at kind of the outcomes at 19 for the older cohort, but a life course approach to understanding children and young people's development looks at what might have shaped that earlier. So I want to address the question of thinking about why we see large differences by 19. And I suppose as part of that, the question becomes a policy one that Alberto raised to start off with. What sorts of approaches might improve equality of opportunity and stop young people being left behind? Language that's coming through with the debates around the Sustainable Development Goal. And just to reflect on the video that we all saw at the start, it was really nice to see that for a number of reasons. It was nice to hear that from young people growing up in the United States, to see the commonalities of the experiences that they were recounting and many of the things that we'll be talking about here with children growing up in lower and middle income countries. But one thing that I suppose I noticed when I listened to that was the focus on education, the focus on a sense of education as something that could be life-changing. And that's a sense that we see coming very strongly from our evidence, from how children and families report their experience. And so thinking about what's needed for equality of opportunity to help education and other systems unlock potential, clearly very important. I want to talk about essentially two aspects. The first is to recognise the critical importance of undernutrition, malnutrition on young children's lives in determining chances. And then I want to talk a little bit about learning, about the school, about the potential of the school, but also some of the evidence that we see around inequalities, inequities in education. So the first slide I wanted to use was to talk a little bit about undernutrition. Now, I'm only going to talk briefly about undernutrition because I want to spend quite a bit of time thinking about the school. But it's a critical issue. The rates, we see high rates of stunting, a key proxy, a key indicator of chronic undernutrition. We see high rates within the Young Lives samples. Stunting is recognised to be a particular problem in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. We see that in our samples. As well, it's important in and of itself for what it says about chronic undernutrition. Undernutrition experienced over a long period of time, but also because of what it says about, because it's associated with a range of negative outcomes for children, negative outcomes for children's health, negative outcomes as a risk factor in child mortality as well as illness, and also because it's related to children's ability to learn later in life. It's associated with impacts on cognition. So that's kind of a key reason for being concerned. Now, given all of those that's a risk factor for children's development, it's notable how even within countries there are stark differences in who is most likely to be experiencing that form of disadvantage. So looking across all of our samples, we see that the poorest children in samples which are, as Ginny I think mentioned, biased slightly towards poorer people in society, are much more likely to be stunted than the less poor within our samples. So if you connect those 2 points, the fact that the poorest in society are most likely to show the signs of undernutrition with all the impacts of undernutrition on them, then it clearly emerges as a channel undermining that form of equality of opportunity that perhaps we would hope. I also just wanted to show a little example from what was the state of Andhra Pradesh in India, looking at stunting rates and how those have changed. So one of the features of the Young Lives study is that we can both look across children's life courses for the same children, but we can also compare at certain age points what was happening for the older cohort with what was happening for the older cohort. So these are children at the same age. This chart there, age 12. But the blue line was those when it was in 2006, and the red in 2013. And what we see there is that there's a slight reduction of the stunting rate. And that's really good news. Not fast enough, but it's good news. But then if you start to disaggregate where that gain is happening, what you see very clearly in this example is that where that gain has happened has actually been for those children who initially had the lowest risk of being stunted. Where the problem was most acute, actually it's changed much less. So the poorest third of children see comparatively little gain over this period of time. So what we're seeing in this example, doesn't happen in all examples, but is a concentration of the problem on the poorest in society. So what might it mean? In terms of this point, I think we would want to reiterate the absolute central importance of early years policy within, in terms of all of the sustainable development goals that might have to do with children. Improving the coverage of early years policy is absolutely central, assuring good conditions for young children. But I suppose we would also want to emphasise that a life course perspective on children's development doesn't just stop at the earliest years. You've got to think about the middle childhood. You've got to think about the adolescent phase as well, and there are advantages in doing so. Now, I want to move on to learning, and as I mentioned, it was really striking to see what a powerful point came out in the video, and it's a powerful point that comes out in our data as well. Young people reporting views of schooling which are very positive, views of schooling that suggest that it is viewed as life-changing for them. That's an assumption made by policymakers as well in many countries. We're investing heavily in education because we hope it'll lead to improved skills and also to social mobility. Then you've got this big question that the SDGs need to confront about, well, will it? We've already heard some of the great successes of that have been achieved in recent years, and enrolment rates are an absolute central to that story. It's a great success, but it's well recognised now that getting young people, getting children into school doesn't always lead to good learning whilst they're there, and we see that in Young Lives data as well. Why might that be? Well, not all of that will be about the school. The school's important, but there are other factors that affect learning, and if you're trying to work out why different children might gain differently from the same systems, understanding what's going on at the household level as well as what's going on at the school is important. So household poverty emerges as a very big factor impacting on young people's lives for many reasons. But we also see that schooling systems can be quite unequal in the opportunities that they deliver to learn. Perhaps in the facilities, perhaps in the quality of teaching that goes on within the classroom, perhaps whether the teachers actually attend regularly to teach the students. If there are unequal opportunities to learn, and if some children are already in a position where they're less likely to gain from that, then it's not hard to see that there's a problem for those children in learning. So there's potential clearly within the SDGs to take a new look at what schooling can deliver and is delivering, and going well beyond the enrolment. And I think that's widely recognised within these debates, but there's a question about how to do it. So I want to use a couple of small pieces of data from Young Lives. The first bit of data that I wanted to use, again, is looking at Andhra Pradesh. This is looking at enrolment. But instead of looking at overall enrolment, it's looking at where young people are enrolled. And it's looking at who's enrolled in private schools. Now, these schools are part of what you might call a no-fee private school system. And that's been increasing quite rapidly within Andhra Pradesh over the period of the study, as we've been following. So some children are enrolled in government schools, some children are enrolled in private schools. And part of the reason that there's been a rapid increase in private schools has been because parents have often believed them to be better, to offer better opportunities for their children. Now, the jury's out about whether that's actually true when you try to break down whether private schools do generally deliver higher quality. The evidence is mixed. But what we do see is that if you look at what's happening in the gaps about who's in private schooling, who's in government schooling, over the period of the study, it's increased. In terms of who's making up those young people in private schools, it's increasingly boys. Boys have been more likely to go into these private schools than girls, as parents presumably are making choices. And by poverty, it's increased gaps in terms between the poorest third and the least poor third. Over this period of time, the least poor third have become much more likely to be in private schools. So I suppose one point that we would just make is that process is creating some level of social distance. And some distance by gender as well. So that was a story about, in a sense, one simple illustration of some inequities that exist within school systems. Now, what's really nice about having a 4-country study is that you can look at where some of the differences are. Now, boiling down why those differences exist is a complex challenge, but we're really interested in findings from Vietnam, because Vietnam does a number of very interesting things in policy terms, and in terms of the outcomes that we see, actually they're often quite positive compared to sometimes what we expect. This example is actually from a school survey that was conducted on young lives children when they were aged about 10 years, and it's over a period of a year, a school year, and what it looks at is who's making progress against the curricula that they were being taught on, and breaking that down into different social groups. And for those of you who don't know Vietnam, there are really big differences between the ethnic minority population in Vietnam and the majority kin population. The ethnic minority population is experiences much higher levels of poverty. So what happened? What this chart illustrates is learning against tests which are based around the curricula. This example is maths, but you see a rather similar picture if you look at Vietnamese language skills as well. So, but there may be different reasons for that. So what it does is you standardize. We've standardized this at 500. I have no idea why it's 500, but that's pretty common in these sorts of studies. And then you look at the incremental gain made over the school year and who's making that incremental gain. Now, the really interesting thing for us is that though you can see that the red line is below the blue line, the red line is the minority population. They know less, or they do less well at the start of the school year in these tests. And they still do less well at the end of the school year. But that gap is narrowing over that period of time. And it's very easy to construct a story about concern about policy, big gaps, big inequalities. Here we see a very positive story about some of the gaps that are narrowing. And as I say, we see it in some other areas as well. Why might that be? Well, then, again, it's a complex story, but looking at what a teaching system delivers feels very important. And we see some interesting findings about lower gaps around things like opportunities to learn in Vietnam. And we see some interesting things about what teachers say and are doing in Vietnam. The point that always sticks in my mind is that when you ask teachers how much they think they can affect the children in their classes' performance, then they give quite positive results in Vietnam. No fatalism about poor children not being able to learn. This is a question about how you bring all of the class up to a level, and I think that's an interesting point to think about when we're addressing this question. Okay, I want to show one more slide of data, I think, and then try to talk a little bit about some of the implications for this. I wanted to talk about gender inequities, absolutely critical issue and well discussed within the discussions about the SDGs. Great concern about particularly young women being disadvantaged in many countries. So we look at this issue and are looking at it quite a bit within the Young Lives study to try to understand where and why gender inequities form. Now, this is a very simple, what's behind this chart is a very simple question, which is, who's in school, by what ages, comparing boys and girls, young men and young women at the last point of observation when we're talking about education in different forms of study. Now, there are a couple of points that you can see from this chart. If the line is below, if the bar is below the line, that means it's biased in favour of boys. More boys are in school or education at that point. If it's above the line, it's biased towards girls and young women. So what we see is actually quite a different picture across these 4 countries. These are only 4 countries. We're not trying to make broader statements about other countries. But these are, it is interesting to note that you see different patterns. So for us, the first point for gender analysis is identifying what the problem is. In Andhra Pradesh, we see really very consistent evidence of growing gender disadvantage over this period of time, and quite starkly so at the last point the last point at age 19, and at that point, as Ginny identified earlier, a number of these young women will have had babies and certainly have married. In Ethiopia and indeed in Vietnam, actually, you see that by 19, more young women are in school than young men, which is an interesting kind of slightly counterintuitive finding in many ways. The reasons for that vary between the countries. It may not all be positive. I mean, a lot of these young men may have dropped out to work and maybe being paid more at that point. And it doesn't prove that young women who've stayed on for schooling long will necessarily get the jobs, the livelihood options later. But it's an interesting point. So why do we think this is happening? 3 points that I would draw out in terms of what shapes decision making about who's staying in school. The first point I wanted to highlight is economic pressure. If a household is under economic pressure, it may well have to make choices. If it has to make choices, then that may well trigger some level of discrimination, either by birth order, by girls and boys, or indeed by between who is assumed to be making the best progress in school. The second point I wanted to highlight was institutional structures. We see a lot of trigger points around school exams, where if a young person doesn't do well in that exam, then that may be a trigger to people leaving. We see a great pressure on young women when they have to go and travel, girls when they have to travel further to school, opening up potential risks around sexual violence. Certainly that gets reported very commonly in the Indian context. And there's a socio-cultural context as well, and I suppose there I wanted to identify that we can look at these processes in childhood, but we also need to look at the wider societies. And if these young women, or indeed young men, are not going to have good opportunities later in life, in adulthood, then it's perhaps not surprising that there may be a pressure to leave school earlier. Right, a couple of implications that I just wanted to run through, and then I'll hand back over to Ginny just to conclude on a couple of key points. So implications. The first point that I wanted to identify began by talking a little bit about early nutrition and the impact that might have on a range of indicators, but also on cognition. The thing I wanted to highlight from our evidence is just that the cognitive gaps exist before children enter school. So if we're looking at a question of learning and trying to improve young people's learning, children and young people's learning, we've got to recognise that not all of that, well, quite a lot of that happens before children have entered school, and that has a number of implications. But we also see that they widen, gaps widen during when children are at school. But the way in which those gaps widen rather varies between the school system that exists. The two examples that we often like to compare are that of Vietnam and Andhra Pradesh. Very different country examples, but India and Vietnam have had a similar GDP per capita. It's interesting that we see the differences that we do. In Vietnam, what we tend to see is that just in terms for every year of additional time in school, Vietnamese children seem to learn more against tests. But as we saw in the example, there's some positive evidence around greater approach to equity delivered by that system. In Andhra Pradesh, we actually see that there's lower additional gain given from each of those additional school years, and we see a number of examples of gaps within the school system. That's not to suggest that you can necessarily transport one school system to another country, but it's interesting drawing the comparison and thinking why that might be. A couple of points to just draw some of that out. First, in policy terms. First, early phase of life is clearly absolutely central. There are a number of clear implications of that around early childhood policies, ECD, early child development policies. Clearly are very important to that phase. In our data, though we do see quite a few children who have some experience of early childhood, actually it's not really the poorest children who have access to those services. Where there's strong public programs, they extend access to wider groups of children, but often it's the poorest who haven't had access to early childhood, so extending coverage is important. 2, household poverty. Reducing household poverty is important in and of itself, but it's also a support to education. It's really encouraging to see all the emphasis going on around social protection and focusing that social protection effort around extending to households with children feels a very important agenda, hopefully, for the SDGs. 3, school effectiveness. We talk a lot about learning, we talk a lot about access to school, but thinking about what makes an effective school is quite a challenging question when you think about it. And for the SDGs, with their greater focus on learning, thinking about that issue of school effectiveness is very important. 4th, school is important for learning, but it's also a space that young people spend an awful lot of their time. And with increasing enrollment rates, then it's covering a lot of children. So what is the potential to capitalise on that? How can we build on that for other purposes? I just wanted to highlight the simple example of school feeding programmes. We see some quite positive evidence around nutritional impacts of school feeding programmes in India, and that's really encouraging. And perhaps it suggests, well, it shows the potential of schools as a platform to do some of this delivery of holistic child development services that Ginny started us off by talking about. 5th, gender disadvantage. We need to get good and better at this. But it both requires a focus on policy for children directly. We see a number of examples of that in the Young Lives country, some active focus in India on extending access to education for girls and for those from marginalised social groups. But all of that sits within a wider societal structure. So when we're thinking about children and what's shaping decision-making around children, we also need to think about that wider power and other social structures. Ginny.
Thanks. Oops. Okay, just one last slide really on final reflections from all of us. The UN General Assembly report emphasises very neatly the need to reduce implementation gaps between the principles and rights enshrined in the UNCRC and the actual living conditions of the most marginalised and excluded girls and boys who are left behind, or one should perhaps say left out. And it also emphasises that many children find themselves living with multiple risks and multiple hazards. Action must be on the basis of mappings of vulnerability that reflects these complexities. I mean, this is something that we feel that Young Lives is well placed to contribute to these debates about, and it is complex, and policymakers don't like complexity, but I think it's important that this multiple risks and multiple hazards idea is brought through into policy. As Paul has said already, the Sustainable Development Goals offer us an opportunity. There's also an opportunity for what's being talked about in the UN High-Level Panel report about data revolution, which has the potential to increase the profile of children. And as Paul has already said, the key messages here, we'd suggest, must be around increasing social protection coverage for households with children and identifying and improving the effectiveness of school for poorer and marginalised children. So that's the end of the presentation. If anybody's interested in finding out more, this is the website. I should emphasise that our survey data are publicly archived. So if anybody wants to access and utilise the survey data, they are free to do so. We produce a number of publications, and it just leaves me to acknowledge and thank hugely the Young Lives children, parents and caregivers, as well as everybody else who's involved in the study, especially our field workers, data managers, survey enumerators, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much indeed.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ginny and Paul. I want to call our panelists, Nick Garipur, Uri, and Shantanu Mukherjee. If you can pass here, please. So, let me introduce, we have two great panelists. It is supposed that we have a third one that is Rosa Hill, that she ran an important NGO here in New York, because we want to mix and to show that something is going on here in New York, but she has an attack of asthma today, that things happen, and she cannot come. So Nick, we are a very good friend, and but on top of that, and maybe very important, he was the former director of the program division in UNICEF, that is probably one of maybe the most important division in UNICEF. I don't want to say nothing, but it's the division that is taking the program ahead and has a different division and is trying to put in place all the things and projects that we are discussing. And now he is the senior advisor on the post-2015 development agenda. So welcome.
Thank you so much.
And we have the other panelist is Shantanu Mukherjee, that is the head of the UNDP MDG teams in the Development Policy Bureau. Shantanu is a development practitioner and microeconomist, and the idea is that I will pose to them two questions, so to have brief answers, and from different point of view, because what we are trying to convey is different perspective and different experience on this question that we are discussing, no? So one is from UNICEF, but the other is more vision from more economic things and more general or different things. So the first question for both of you is, what do you think, in view of the finding that Young Life showed to us, and in your own experience, what matters most to deliver a good life chance for children living in poverty? And if you can suggest us 3 key priorities for policy and programs. So, who wants to start? And Nick?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Alberto, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to be here. And like all of you, equity and the universality of children's rights is a very personal experience. It's something that drives everything that we do, everything that we commit to do now and into the future. And it's great to be here. What matters the most? I think from the study and from our practical field experience, it is absolutely critical that there is a policy commitment to reaching the poorest and the most disadvantaged first, to make a big distinction between a trickle-down approach where eventually everybody gets reached, at least theoretically. But the question here is making a policy decision and a commitment to reach the poorest and the most disadvantaged first. And this is both complex and simple, in the sense that because the study is located within the paradigm of child poverty, we have to understand that it is not just one silver bullet that needs to reach the poorest first. It's a multidimensional situation. And so there are going to be equalizing policies. There are going to be deliberate policies that narrow the gap or lift the curve for the poor. And there are going to be almost affirmative action type policy interventions that would cause acceleration, even if we're talking about coverage or about the uptake of services and so on. And lastly, I think it is critical to realize that the early years don't start with the day the child is born. They start with the mother. So maternal health and nutrition, women's social and economic status in society, and where the woman is coming from matters a lot more than we at the policy level realize. And so the first 1,000 days, the cliche word, but it is about the mother and those very early days, very early few days of a child's life. And I think in looking at the interventions, I'm sure we'll come to those, it is critical that the demand side, which is empowerment strategies, strategies that move away from looking at poor households, poor children, poor women as passive recipients of aid, to investments and policy decisions that deliberately empower and uplift the voices, the condition, and the participation of local populations, local women's groups, local leaders, so that they are in turn able to play a role in all of this. And for that to happen, nothing better than decent work and the ability to earn a wage. So let me sort of pause there with those reflections before we get into the technical, specific sectoral interventions.
Thank you very much, Nick. And Shantanu, yes.
Well, let me also begin by thanking Alberto, the new school, and Gunay for this opportunity to reflect on some terribly important and very useful findings that the study is bringing out. As well as Alberto mentioned, I work on the MDGs, and one of the interesting things about working on the MDGs is that it gives you license to really look at a whole host of issues. And it's always interesting to learn more and make connections. So this must have been Child Poverty Month for me, because just a week back I was first in Pakistan, which has the second largest number of out-of-school children in the world, at 6 million, about 12%, trying to help figure out how the UN system and the World Bank working together could do something to address this issue. And a little prior to that, I was in Laos PDR, which has one of the highest rates of child stunting, which I'm sure is well known to all of you, but was new to me. And what is more distressing is that it is falling slower than the population growth rate there. So you're actually adding children who are going to be stunted. And what is also alarming, that stunting rates among the wealthiest quintile, based on this asset index measure, is as high as 20%. So, you know, I mean, it just points out, I think, some of the issues that have been so eloquently placed here about the complexity of these issues we are dealing with. And Nick already mentioned the silver bullet example, and I think it allows me also to share with you my reflections on reading the study. And since we are constrained to just 3 points, I think the first takeaway point for me is the increasing degree of interconnectedness of all development outcomes. And I think as we start moving away, as we start making more and more progress, and we are moving away from the very high levels of deprivation to levels that are slightly lower, I think it's more and more important to appreciate this interconnectedness. Because it means that continuing to work as we have always done may not be the most efficient way of getting results. We are reaching diminishing marginal returns sometimes. I mean, just to give you an example from some work I did in Uganda, the choice was between building more schools in an area which had started off with very low levels of school provision, But since the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals, this had crept up, so school coverage was not too bad. Or actually making sure that the teachers' attendance at the schools went up beyond 50%, which it was on any one day. Now, you can understand the politics and the policy implications of both. But clearly building another school, if you had to invest a limited amount of money, building another school was probably going to be less effective than making sure your teaching manpower was there at 100%. So, but when you think of it that way, you also understand that the forces that are keeping teachers away from schools are far more complex than what the education sector and what its reward and incentive structure can actually influence. So right away, because you have actually picked the low-hanging fruit in a sense, you've built the schools, you've taken care of some of the supply side, you now have to move towards the high-hanging fruit. And the high-hanging fruit may be something which the sector itself may not be best placed to address. There are other issues that need to be taken into account, and therefore, not only are development outcomes interconnected in research or in a paradigm or in theory, but they're also interconnected at a very fundamental level when you're trying to get impact. When we move to the high-hanging fruit, as we are doing now, I think the study brings out some of these points very well. We need sustained attention. It's not enough to have it at a particular point in time or a particular point in the life cycle. It needs to be sustained. We need to address quality, which is, terribly thorny issue. Nick mentioned how we need to complement the supply with demand, and I would also say we need to improve accountability. And these are all things that we need to do if we are going to start moving towards the high-hanging fruits of development. And my final point would be that, again, the mandate that's coming out from discussions around the SDGs, and actually from the country's own aspirations, which I think is more important than what the General Assembly does or doesn't do, is really this need to reach all, everyone. And I don't think as a policy community or even as a research community, we have fully grappled with the implications of what it means to reach all, what it means to cover the last mile to go from 90% to 100%. And I think as we reflect on this as practitioners, as people who work in the field, who work with partners, we will see more and more that we need to do things differently. The tide that lifted school enrollment through quick wins from 40% to 90% may not be the one that delivers the last 10% of the school. And this imperative of covering everybody, leaving no one behind, means that we have to think differently about how we do business, but also how we measure. I have survey experts in this room. I don't need to tell them, or I don't need to share with them the horror stories of trying to find an event which is rare and occurs only 10% of the time, and you have, a limited budget with which to capture it.
Thank you very much, Shantanu. So the second question is about the challenge. Yeah? So because these are very good points, but there are many challenges. What are the most important challenges that you are thinking that we are facing in the next, now and in the next future years, in this very complicated world that we are seeing now? So do you want to start? Yes, please.
Okay. So, the challenges are multifaceted, but I think it's really not a gloom and doom scenario. I mean, we've learned a lot since these kind of coordinated efforts came into place. We've had plenty of experiences in countries on how to do better. And I think if I think about challenges and take a step back so that I'm looking at the bigger picture, to my mind, what comes through is three main issues. And in all of these, we have made some progress, but not nearly enough. the first one, I think, is to unpack a little bit. We often hear this buzzword about national ownership and political leadership. And I think we need to unpack a little bit what it means and recognize that it is only the very first step towards reaching results. So what can we do to enhance the efficacy of the next steps that would be there? So, you know, for example, just to go back to Pakistan and last PDR, the incentives for political leadership and ownership vary across countries. Now in Pakistan, the Prime Minister made a commitment to deliver 4% of the GDP for education and has decentralized extensively so provinces have a great deal of autonomy in planning and budgeting around education. These would seem to be hopeful steps, but obviously with a tax to GDP ratio of about 2% in Pakistan, how 4% is going to be delivered for education is a bit of a question mark. But it also says that intentions are not good enough. We have to improve something outside of the education sector, just in order to deliver on what has been promised for the education sector. And in Lao PDR, the government has a national aspiration to escape LDC status. And one of the indicators by which you're assessed as having escaped that status is the percentage of malnourishment. So clearly in both these countries, there are public commitments to doing something about nutrition, about education. But how do you translate this commitment into action is the challenge that we have to work with. Clearly, as as Paul said, these are countries, most of the developing countries have shown strong growth. So the fiscal space is opening up there. But we have to see how that is translated into opportunity. And so from our experience, we find that the one sort of approach which works in these circumstances is actually to not speak to the converted, but to speak to the skeptics. And to speak about how they are going to balance, make arguments that make sense to them in their own language. When you're sitting with the finance ministry official or you're sitting with the planning commission, that person is juggling a whole range of issues, challenges, and albeit the development parameters are interconnected, this person is tasked with making trade-offs. On the one hand, you can speak about increasing the pie, creating more fiscal space through better tax administration, collection, liquidity over time, and so on. But then you also have to understand the language with which you approach them and make the case for greater investment in this area for its long-term potential, but also for its immediate ones. The second challenge, which I think we have all met, is how to foster the collaboration across sectors. I mean, in any kind of good outcome that we are trying to get is going to need a mix of sectoral activities and activities from outside the sector. Just to give you an example, in Benin, the work we were doing over there was about expanding access to water, drinking water. And the country actually has a really good rural water supply extension program, which is reaching very far-flung areas. But that is owned by the Public Health Engineering Department or something like that. So where is the incentive of the Public Health Engineering Department to see that when a young girl's time to collect water gets cut down and she actually has more time on her hands, that she spends it in going to school or in some learning activity? No, they measure their progress by the number of water points connected and population served, and they'll do a periodic test on the quality of water, which is their mandate. But where is the incentive for them to translate this into a learning dividend? It's not there. And where is the incentive for the education department to piggyback on the rollout of the water supply extension scheme? Because they're responding to a different set of parameters and annual work plans and so on. And sorry, our budget is already committed and we didn't know they were going to do this. So how are you going to bring these together? As one gets into the nitty-gritty of this kind of structure, the incentives that are needed for joint work, we really find them to be absent and sometimes even sort of disincentivized. I would say that's another challenge that we need to look at, and maybe we can pick up some more things in the course of the discussion.
Nick, I'm sure that we will have some discussion here. Nick,
Should I? Okay. let me just compliment Shantanu's very good points. One major challenge is capacity and resources. It's no secret that much of what needs to be delivered in terms of public health, education, nutrition support, protection, all gravitate towards the same public sector budget and the same officials at the decentralized level. And most countries, especially in the developing world, are grappling constantly with chronic shortages of staff, capacity, and resources. And so in all of the efforts that we make, particularly where you're talking about a multi-sectoral strategy that needs to hit different types of outcomes to be effective, the first major challenge is always, where is the resources going to come from? Where is the additional capacity going to come from? And so you find that in practice, policymakers are challenged with robbing Peter to pay Paul, or basically just making do, muddling through with very little resources, and the resulting donor dependence, which has hurt a lot of the systems out there. And so a major challenge is capacity, resources, and very weak systems, and accountability, transparency, aspects related to the oversight of these systems being particularly weak as you go along. And the reason this is important is that when you look at early childhood development, or the types of results that we are looking for, which go beyond the ability of one sector or one department single-handedly to deliver, you're looking at a government counterpart system that does not have the ability to coordinate and lead all of this work that involves the Ministry of Health or the Health Department, education, and other parts of the government system in one place. So the health people have their health programs and their health targets and their health objectives, yet they are absolutely critical to what happens to early childhood and cognitive development. The social welfare department deals with another set or another part of that reality. And there's usually a spread across different institutions and different offices of the responsibility and the accountability to lead in this area. And so this fragmentation not only makes it difficult because of the duplication, wastage of resources, but also very, very difficult to coordinate work in situations of weak systems and oversight. How does one address this situation? To me, my experience is that what I have observed so far at country level is the critical value of policy coherence at the planning and the strategic level where the conceptualization happens, rather than a project approach to financing and addressing these issues. So, so that if early childhood care and development is a national development strategy, say in Rwanda, then the orchestration, the conceptualization, the financing of this national priority is done at the level of the presidency or the Ministry of Plan and Finance that has a convening power over a number of sectoral ministries rather than just one sector single-handedly. So that's one aspect that I would like to highlight. The other relates to the interconnectedness of the programmatic interventions. What comes to my mind as I listen to you, Shantanu, was the experience in India in polio eradication, where for several years, 10 to 15 years, children were receiving repeated doses of the oral polio vaccine over and over again. But you always had polio cases in Bihar and parts of Uttar Pradesh. And the reason was that because we were dealing with an oral polio vaccine that required a gut reaction that would kick in with the immunity in a situation where environmental sanitation and the quality of water and personal hygiene, etc., was so low that children were having such repeated bouts of diarrhea that the vaccine never really kicked in. And so there was this continuous effort to vaccinate until the water and sanitation team got brought along to join the polio effort of the public health team. And some 7,000 house-to-house social mobilizers were deployed to go house to house to really talk to communities and work with local communities to improve hygiene practices, sanitation, and so on. That illustrates the fact that as we move into the new development context, where the level of ambition that's envisaged brings together climate change, economic development, and social development into one so-called sustainable development framework. That level of ambition requires that we clearly move into a new institutional arrangement that underscores the need for multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder partnerships and intersectoral action, so that water and sanitation and people's knowledge, health literacy, and nutrition literacy levels are critical for the outcomes that we are looking for in health, in early childhood development, and particularly in nutrition. One cannot conceptually develop nutrition support programs to tackle stunting without dealing with the water, sanitation, and hygiene aspects. And that's the critical factor, or the deworming aspects, which afflict the same children that we're talking about here. So that even if you have school feeding programs and you're not deworming children, there's no sanitation. In fact, you are only feeding the worms. So those are the additional aspects that I would like.
Thank you very much. I think that this opened the floor. Let's open the floor, because I'm sure that, and maybe you can move also.
Yes.
So if there's any question, please. Yeah, there's one question there.
It looks rather nice. I forgot to bring mine.
Yeah. Christian.
Thanks very much, Christian Salazar from UNICEF. I mean, first, congratulations, to all the panelists. So really, I think very strong and interesting discussion we're having. I really enjoyed it. I wake up with Ebola, then I go to the militarization and the impact on millions of children in the Syria crisis. We look at the Intifada coming back. We look at the situation in South Sudan and Chad, and we see that from climate change to growing conflicts to fiscal deficits, all the factors are there that we will see quickly growing fragility in the world. That's an assumption. And already today, the largest cohorts of children unreached by any service live in fragile countries. And the discussion that we've been hearing, which actually is excellent, and it really reflects also a lot of thinking, discussion, but is somehow based, and even the examples on your lives, on quite steady development paths. But we're looking at least, at least where I'm sitting, into a different future, which is really worrisome. So my question, I guess, is maybe to Paul or to, I don't know really to address it. If you look at the SDGs in the future and the impact that we can expect from growing conflict and disasters on children, what are the policy choices there, or how should we make those connections for the future of growing cohorts of children, to say those not left behind will live in those situations? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take some other.
Thank you so much for sharing this eye-opening findings, and it's really some interesting the data. But let me start with the word that you have used, the poverty, inequality, kind of thing. So these are very loaded words. It's a very contextual, and I'm coming back to some of the things that you mentioned. So how, in your study, how you define the term poverty? Because it differs from India to Ethiopia to Vietnam. And so that might have, some kind of cascading or whatever the model you say kind of impact. But, these, again, the issues of poverty and education and resources also do not have one-to-one correspondence. And I can just give one example. In the United States, in a particular community in Chicago for last 7-8 years, more than 100 children got killed in gang fights, despite all resources, despite all intervention. So when so my question is that, have you seen any correlation when the program that comes from top down? So you mentioned about India's program of Manrega, Mahatma Gandhi, rural, kind of act. But just today, there is a data, and it's a huge hue and cry in India, that within 5 months, 250 farmers committed suicide in Telangana, the state that you mentioned. And so far, Indian government, the new prime minister or anything, has done nothing at all. So how that's impacting in terms of the children who were there? And I can give another example when children begged money, putting their father's dead body on a road to give a proper funeral. So you can imagine how the desperate situation. But let me say, so that's my question. But I also try to see, what you said, there is a light after every tunnel. So there is no correlation between the things that we observed in Ethiopia, where girls are going to school in a large number compared to other countries. When in Ethiopia, according to your UN development report on the bottom, so there is no correlation how you imply or what the definition you say. But as I said, my question is, do you see any kind of correlation between upper program intervention versus local program intervention in terms of your data? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Is any other? Well, yeah, let's take 3, but please do short question. We have one here. One. And after.
I just wanted to ask for a clarification about the data presented by Paul regarding gender. There was 8, 12, 15, and 19. I wanted to know if all the data there were from the same cohort, or the second cohort was also used for the data for the 8 and 12. Just a clarification.
come here and come back there, yeah? So we can move from one.
Okay. I was just wondering, how do you expect to reach children that aren't registered by the state? They don't have a birth certificate, they don't exist. And you're saying you should start at the bottom, but these are the people that are usually at the bottom, the people that don't have an identity, that are exposed to all these horrible things, and how can you deal with that?
Thank you. So.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting panel. Thank you all. You had one finding about the cognitive gaps between the social groups were well in place before the children entered school. Paul, and I think you mentioned too that the gaps widened with the impact of the school system. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate that a little bit more, because as you know, in the United States, and I was involved with this for 5 years, we evaluated the Early Head Start Research Project, and we followed 3,000 moms and kids for 5 years from the day the children were born. And 85% of those children were about a standard deviation behind when they even started school at 36 months. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on your findings about the preschoolers and what those cognitive gaps were, and how are we going to address some of these challenges to address early childhood needs, because early childhood education is just so important, and we're not seeing it in the developing world.
Thank you. So the last
now and then a second round, because there's a lot of questions.
No, we have one more there, and we are coming to the panel, and we are closing.
Thank you very much. I have the study was a great diversity. So I like also the changes and the differences in the correlations. So one point that's a little bit is strengthening some ideas that we had in mind is that poverty is not everything. So the case of India and the correlation between the stunting rates within different quintiles and different castes and whatever you can look at, it showed that maybe there are other elements of capacity that needs to be looked at and needs to be studied as root causes of child rights not being fulfilled. So looking at the knowledge and the proverb that says that ignorance kills more than anything else. That is something which probably we need to invest more and more on, and look at what type of interventions do we need to promote more to reach the fulfillment of the rights of more children.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to come back to the panel, and maybe because we want to close and we have a cocktail, so we can have face-to-face conversation. So let's come back to the panel.
Okay, really quickly, can I just deal with Christian's very important point about the fact that Young Lives is not a study that's taking place?
You can use
the microphone. Okay. I mean, this is obviously of crucial importance, and I would just say we need more longitudinal studies, and we need to try to do them in conflict-affected states. That is actually a big challenge. But the Young Lives study countries, you can't suddenly say, I don't want to be doing it in these fast-growing economies. You can't just jump ship and say, oh, not interesting anymore. I mean, it's really a problem. So let's see some more birth cohort studies taking place in these very problematic parts of the world would be my suggestion. So I'm going to let Paul deal with all the other questions. And I might just intervene. I've written them all down. That was a lot. Yeah.
Fine.
How do we define poverty in the study? Could you just talk to how poverty is defined?
Let me make a run at some of those questions. Yep. I won't get them all because my memory is of limited capacity. And first, can I say thank you very much to the discussants, because those were such thoughtful comments, and taking it to what Ginny and I did was we talked about data, but you were setting that in the context of governance and of what you need in systems, and that's absolutely critical. And I mean, I just briefly wanted to reflect on two of the points that I thought that really came strongly to me. through what you were saying. I mean, one was just returning to this issue of decent work. And I wanted to link that slightly to the comment that was being made in relation to the Indian circumstance. And you were referring, I think, to many of the economic pressures on particularly presumably the farming community and what that's led to. And the importance of decent work in being able to pay a sustained livelihood is clearly absolutely critical. There's a demographic context to all of this as well. When we're looking at youth transitions, there's got to be a question about what are those young people going to be doing, and if the world isn't generating sufficient decent jobs, then it's a big question. Clearly a huge national challenge. So that was one thing that really struck me about the comments. The other thing was this issue about integration, policy synergies. How do you make that breakthrough for the very marginalised in society? Huge policy challenge, but I thought what was quite interesting was some of the examples that were starting to be given about some areas where that's worked. I mean, the issue of polio and the role of WASH services in that was quite an interesting rejoinder to this issue about, well, how do you incentivise policy action in one siloed sector that supports another? And I was just thought that was a very nice reflection. And the other, this mention of deworming processes. I mean, that in many ways it could be seen as a health nutritional intervention, but it's got educational implications as well. So picking on these sorts of examples where we can think about how to support those forms of integration was really very important, I thought. Just a couple of points of clarity. Of course, measuring poverty is a difficult, challenging question, both a conceptual question and also relates to different national circumstances. What we were referring to was differences in wealth levels, wealth being a summary indicator of housing conditions, service access and consumer durable access at a household level. And we were comparing those who had a higher level of wealth on that level with those who had a lower level of wealth. But you can break these things down in different ways, but we were trying to show the inequities in our sample. That was one point of clarification. The other point of clarification related to gender, that's the same cohort. That's following the older cohort through. We can talk in more detail, but that's what that was. Ginny's talked a little bit about conflict. I mean, I think that was a very fair kind of question, and we won't really give a good answer to that very important issue, beyond to say that there are aspects of fragility and post-conflict in the studies in the countries that we are looking at. Vietnam, there's fragility in parts of Ethiopia. So, but it's clearly a question when we're thinking about how to get to the most marginalised at a national level. I mean, clearly that's critical. I wanted to just say two more quick things, one of which is this kind of critical issue that's always been part of the issue of the convention, which is securing good registration, making sure that we've got good lists of which children are in society so that we can know what's going on about their rights. Just one kind of positive example there, I think, is the extent to which things like social protection systems can help in supporting incentivising getting better registration of those in society. Maybe it doesn't reach all, but looking for positive solutions there. The other comment I just wanted to make was around early child development. I won't get into discussions about the standard deviation, so we've got a paper that I'd like to share that tries to talk about the relative gain through the schooling process, but I won't talk about that kind of technical detail now. What I did want to talk about was reach of ECD programs, and there's another question about the quality of those ECD programs. I mean, clearly it is a hugely important agenda. We've done a bit of work trying to map what's happening about ECD processes, or what's happened about ECD within the Young Lives children's experience. And we see some differences across the countries. I wanted to highlight that where the reach of those of ECD has been greatest in the Young Lives countries, it's really been in Peru and in India, where there were public programs which tried to extend access. The example where we had least access is in Ethiopia, where it was almost entirely a private system, though there is an early childhood policy. a policy thrust. But if you leave it to the market, then the poorest children are not going to get access to early childhood. Then there are obvious questions about quality and maximising quality that need to be attended to. I just wanted to, as a final comment, return to something which I think was kind of voiced a little bit by both of you in the discussion point, but also I think goes to some of the ECD point as well, which is that in a sense when I look at our data, what it makes me think is that in policy terms, if you reach the poorest children and you do so effectively, you'll have sorted out many of the other problems as well. Not all of the problems. I take the concern that was being raised in the back. There are issues of kind of social norms, other things that are important also. But if you're trying to make a really big impact on many of these issues, if you've addressed what's going on for the most marginalised children, then I think many of the other problems that we're seeing will follow. But anyway, I think that's it. That's enough.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Nick?
I wanted to maybe pick up from there. I'm sure you're thinking what I'm thinking, in the sense that thanks so much, Christian, for raising the issue of the fragility of societies and the risk of unrest. Because as a matter of fact, the connection is that if, in fact, we look 15 years down the road into the future, 2030, and all the ambitious goals that are being discussed, and the vision that is behind those goals, the level of ambition and the world that's envisaged is directly threatened by issues of insecurity, fragility, and unrest. I mean, there's no other development context that amplifies quite as much as situations of fragility, conflict, chronic complex emergencies, including those that are multiple in nature, overlapping, so to speak, and concurrent. And so one has got to take a step back and ask, what are the policy and programmatic options available really? I mean, you can, of course, provide responses by providing humanitarian assistance. But I think where you're trying to get is to look at the root causes and the underlying causes and go back to some of the same issues that we are talking about here. Investing early, bridging the gap, narrowing the gap between those who have something at stake and those who have nothing at stake and nothing to lose, and taking a long-term perspective on this investment. Because until we make that reality the operational paradigm for tackling conflict, insecurity, extremism, I don't believe there is a single way that one vaccine can resolve this issue. We've got to go back and address the underlying structural anomalies that underlie this kind of perpetual exclusion and the extremism that flows from there. Unfortunately, if you look at it from that perspective, you get a very big sense of urgency because it looks like we haven't been really tackling the issue for a long, long time, particularly education, investing in early childhood, and narrowing the gap. Because if we don't narrow the gap and we make a lot of progress, but in making that progress, we leave, well, this is equity, this is about equity. And that's the story of our discussion. And we must measure it and report on whether or not the equity gaps are stagnating and narrowing or are widening.
Thank you, Nick.
I think it's terribly unfair to be the last speaker when so many good things have already been said, and you realize that everything you wanted to say has gone on already. But I just wanted to pick up on the points Nick was making about fragility and how to deal with it. I think fragility is again something that's incredibly important. It threatens a lot of the gains we have made and makes it harder to go to completion. But I think we also have to recognize that there is a continuum in the term fragility itself. And by way of full disclosure, let me say that I used to work for a long time in India as a district officer, including running the polio immunization campaign.
Okay.
So,
so there you are.
And when I hear the term fragility, it reminds me that in large multi-ethnic states, there are parts, constituent parts, that are moving in and out of the fragile state condition all the time, and for varying periods, varying durations. For a long time, in the part of India that I worked, government services just could not be provided in certain areas that were under the control of so-called rebels, and you would have seen that in Telangana as well. On the other hand, you have situations like in Yemen right now, where the entire central state structure has collapsed. But I think what it points to is the need for us to be flexible and engage with the diversity of actors. Because different actors deliver services at different places. And we have to see how to engage with them and build up that capacity as well. It's not always the state actor that's the best or most effective actor. And the second thing I think is, as Nick pointed out, actually fragility and development are very closely connected. And the antidote to one is probably also the antidote to the other. And the more conscious we are of building this into our work so that our humanitarian work actually leads to longer term development gains as well, instead of just taking care of the immediate problem, I think the better the chances of success. And finally, just a quick reflection on the point that was made about how to make sure that we're reaching the, the really hard to reach children. I think as Paul was mentioning, some of these social protection programs, which more and more countries are rolling out, are giving a tremendous boost to actually issuing identity documents and identity cards. India, for example, now has a universal identification scheme with linked to electronic fund transfer and so on. And there are many other countries actually investing in this kind of thing, which opens up the potential for addressing some of those issues. I remember from my time there, I always thought a lot of my staff were busy doing some kind of survey or the other. You had the below poverty line survey to identify people who would benefit from certain programs. You had the electoral rolls updating survey, because you have to make sure that your electoral roll is current when there are elections. You have the land record survey, because you want to make sure that your land records are in place. And you have the census, which comes every 10 years. And I'm not even talking about the regular, the sample survey for income and consumption, which happens every 5 years. So I think there is tremendous potential for within the normal administrative working in many countries, not all of course, to actually complete the mapping of which household is living where, what condition it is in, and being able to track how they are themselves progressing over time through various sort of vicissitudes of fortune. So I think the potential is there. It depends on how best we can support it, how best we can actually transfer the knowledge of what's working well in country to another. And I think that's where some of our organizations and some of the work that we do actually have a big role to play, so that this transfer of knowledge and this transfer of technology is facilitated, works well, and gives real benefits.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to call Michael Cohen, that is the Director of International Affairs, and I want to say that he supports equity for children from the beginning. We start, and he said, well, go ahead, move ahead, and we always not only agree on many things, we are close friends, but also he is a big supporter to put in equity for children at the new school, and he's the Director of International Affairs, so he agreed on saying some final remarks. Mike, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I'd just like to congratulate all the members of the panel and the speakers very rich evening and conversation. Listening to, I'd like to make a couple of comments about what I heard. One of the things that struck me is that the study demonstrates the complexity of cumulative causation and how outcomes are not tied to individual inputs, and there's a whole set or a series of outcomes that the complexity of the patterns of causation, very frequently in development policy discussions, we don't really come clean with those. We don't really indicate, yes, this is the result of many different things. And we constantly plead ignorance because we don't have enough longitudinal studies. So now we have longitudinal study, and we see this complexity. But that, in the conversation, it seems to me that that causes another dilemma, okay? Which is that once you understand that pattern of cumulative causation, what do you think about with regard to policy and institutions? So the second two speakers were really talking about the complexities and the difficulties of applying understanding where you have cumulative causation. And what struck me in this was that nobody really wanted to go out on a limb and say, for example, which interventions are more cost effective than others. We don't really know about effectiveness. You know, I mean, the example of the polio vaccination was fascinating in terms of, you know, the relationship with water and these things. So does that lead you to the conclusion that you do water before you do polio, or what? So it raises questions about sequencing. It raises questions about priorities, and it may be that our lack of real understanding of sequencing doesn't let us adequately take advantage of our understanding of multiple causation, of cumulative causation. So the question of sequencing is really interesting. And it's not just a problem unique to this sector. You see it in macroeconomic policy. You see it in every sector. Right? That's one part of it. The other thing that struck me, and that was in the richness of the comments where country examples were invoked, whether, for example, the startling results about stunting in Laos, is this a function, is this a cultural phenomenon? Is this related to the overall other contextual variables that are producing this? Which got me thinking, as you're going along, that there may be situations where really good policy with regard to specific kind, let's say, getting young girls into education, really a focused policy, whether it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition to allow something to go further, or to get the full benefits of these things. So I'm wondering about the relationship between sort of more macro things going on in the country and the fiscal base. I mean, in the end, we need a fiscal base to provide the vaccinations, or to do the healthcare services, or to build the schools. So what is there a relationship between the macro and the micro? We had a seminar here in this room 4 or 5 years ago where somebody said, we can't understand why Bangladesh suddenly reduced their fertility rate so much, because we couldn't find any macro explanation for that. It happens from policy. It was pretty interesting because I think it was somebody from the UN system who, I forget which agency, but the point being that how important is the context? How important does the context affect this patterns of multiple causation? So I guess it means we've got to do a lot more research. Okay? We've got to do a lot more, and longitudinal analysis isn't enough. But I'm struck by the lack of discussion, not in so much this panel, but in general, on the question of the effectiveness of various kinds of interventions. You know, we don't really, you know, so when the military decides they need to build another battleship or they want to put another jet, they say, well, okay, we're going to do this, and we have to do this to deal with some fictitious enemy. On the other hand, here we've got real problems, and somehow if we were able to be more focused on what actually matters in terms of efficacy, then maybe we can put a bigger bet behind it and see whether in fact it produces that result. Let me just end with a little anecdote here. I spent what felt like 1,000 years working in the World Bank, and then I finally escaped 15 years ago. And in our classes here, we talk about I used to talk a lot about projects. So at one point, we were talking about an urban project in Dakar, in Senegal, that was started in 1972, that went along very slowly. The government declared it was a failure in 1982. The bank decided it was a failure. This was a sites and service project with infrastructure and housing. And so I'm mentioning this to students here, and finally a group of women students, 8 of them, came to me and said, this was 2005, we want to see what happened to that project. They had read all the documentation about it. So they went, we sent them for 8 weeks to live in Dakar and study this project. What they discovered was that this project, while it might have been declared a failure in 1982, had 500,000 people living in it in 2005, and it was one of the more desirable neighborhoods. And the question came up, why was this thing a failure in 82 and a roaring success, 25 years later? And how do you explain that? And then we began to ask the question, does anybody actually do long-term evaluation? So I went back to the Director General of the World Bank and I said, well, do we do that? Did the bank do that? Well, no. We don't really look at things 30 years later. And I remember asking my colleague Sakiko Fukudapar here, does she know of examples in the UN of really going and looking at the long term? I said, well, there's not that much of that either. And then somebody gave me a copy of the Dead Aid book by Dambisa Moyo. I said, well, how would she know that it was dead? Because nobody's looked over time. So it seems to me that not only do we need longitudinal studies, but we desperately need sort of longer term evaluation to come to the question of efficacy, to better understand the causation. And so one of the things we're actually trying to do in this school is get graduate students to get into the evaluation business, to go out and look and see what's happening. So it's I don't know, somehow when we talk about that here, the students are encouraged and we try to mobilize to do that. But it really has a link, it seems to me, with these policy questions. We need a whole new generation of development research, impact research, and not just looking at the outputs of whether the money was spent. We really need to look at outcomes as you're trying to do. So anyway, I really appreciate the meeting, and I want to congratulate Equity for Children. This is a little university with global ambition, in the sense that we're interested in big questions, and we really would like to, we think the questions are compelling and important, and this is kind of a perfect room to discuss these things. We have the wonderful murals of Orozco with the struggles of the Orient here and the structures of the Occident here, and just reminds us to be humble in front of all of these things. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much to all of you. Thank you to the panelists and to the presenters. And there is a wine that we want to share. It's outside, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you very much.